I encountered the story of the Einsatzgruppen in the course of reading about human violence, which is something my work has focused on as an historian and a writer. The fact is, to read about the Holocaust in any of its aspects is to be traumatized. I had nightmares. I had a great difficulty dealing with this material. Ultimately, what moved me to push through those feelings and tell this story was that these victims had never really been celebrated. Their story had never really been told. And even more terribly, I think, the general belief of historians is that the death camps were the center of the story. That the Einsatzgruppen killings generally have been shrugged off as wild excesses of the SS, which to me basically means that those historians also really didn't want to confront this material.
Lemberg, die Stadt zeigt Spuren schwersten Kampfes. Die ukrainische Bevölkerung empfängt unsere Soldaten begeistert als Befreier vom Blutterror des Bolschewismus.
The Einsatzgruppen massacres preceded the invention of the death camps. When the German army invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen followed behind the army, ostensibly to pacify the civilians when the army moved on. But part of their program was to murder Jews. And the idea of mass industrialized killing really hadn't come up yet.
Das Judenviertel von Jonava, das gleichfalls nach dieser Anordnung verschont wurde, wird gesäubert. Auch hier terrorisierte das jüdische Gesindel im Bunde mit den GPU-Agenten die litauische Bevölkerung in der furchtbarsten Weise.
Institutionally, to put it in a nutshell, the Einsatzgruppen were essentially mobile offices of the Reich Main Office for Security, responsible for a region and would move with the advance of German troops, pacifying and securing an area until such time as reinforcements arrived for the Germans to really begin implementing some of their longer-term race and settlement plans.
These people kill every day, several times a week, entire communities, no end. On to the next one. They don't seem to tire, they don't seem to slack, and they're relentless about it. They're also not satiated by the blood that they have spilled. Let's go to the next place. More. No satisfaction, no end.
There were 4 Einsatzgruppen. The largest, which was Einsatzgruppe A, consisted of about 900 personnel, of whom maybe half were actual police officers, and the remainder were support personnel, truck drivers, clerks, paymasters. The locals provided the rest of the manpower. Generally, the ratio of German nationals to locals was probably about 60-40 in the major operations, and then, of course, much less in these initial operations where there were fewer German personnel on hand.
They had their hands full. They were killing hundreds of thousands of people, one bullet at a time. You had to have a pit dug, you had to gather the people together. It took time, it was trouble. They had a terrible logistics problem. So the Einsatzgruppen specifically preceded the death camps and were, in my judgment as a historian who's looked very carefully at the record, the reason for the invention of the death camps.
שוכן במרומים, אמצי מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר רקיע מזהירים. אז נשמות כל אלה ויששוק הקדושים והטהורים שהוא מתו ושנהרגו ושנשחטו.
At this time, I'd like to call up Tzvi Mikhailovsky.
Hello, everybody. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
I was with 100 people in line. Here was on the left side Chaim Levitan, a neighbor, me, my father, my brother, Shmuel Paikovsky. That's 5 people in this line. And we saw a bunch of clothing in front of us from the previous groups. A German was sitting knee, one foot at the other, a machine gun on his knee, and pointed not on us, but on the pitch. We were meanwhile undressing. I saw my father naked. I saw all the neighbors naked. Myself I didn't see. My brother, he didn't look on me, he didn't look on nobody. He was putting his face on my father's leg, and he grabs him so hard, he wouldn't let him off. He wouldn't let, my father could make a step without his head. And the end, we going to the graves, step by step, by the doors. My father armed me with his hand on my arm, and machine gun started to. I fall down. I remember. He pushed me down. I fall in before him. I assume he fell down on me. I didn't see him falling down on me, but he was the closest down on me, and the nearest to me, howling and blood spilling. Seconds. and stopped quiet. That happened in September, Rosh Hashanah 1941.
Let me go through the steps, how this had to happen. Bear in mind that the Jews in a given area were usually concentrated well before in a specific section of town, or if it was from the countryside and the smaller towns into the largest town around.
They had identified the Jews in advance, pulled them all into the town center. And again, they were careful not to let anyone really know what the end result was going to be as much as they could until it was too late.
They would be marched up to the edge after they were made naked. In most cases, we know because we have diagrams of the killing, 2 or 3 or 4 people would shoot people, normally in the back. And the reason you had 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 is essentially so that none of the killers had an individual responsibility. I don't know if it's my bullet that killed if I'm a killer or somebody else's.
They were shot usually by security police and SD personnel. Sometimes volunteers from among the auxiliaries were sought, and they were involved doing the shooting as well. After the men were gone, then they went after the women and children. The fiendish thinking behind this strategy was that if they killed the women and children first, the men would be more likely to fight because they'd have nothing left to lose. And then another layer of people would be shot. Once the pit was filled to capacity, it would be covered over after another layer of soil was put on, layer of lime, and then topsoil would be covered.
Now, the local townspeople report something very interesting. They report that the ground was moving for several days. There's reason to believe now that the reason that the earth was unsettled and the earth was moving is that for several days there still were some people alive there, some people who were still moving, and the earth didn't cover them fully, or there was a pocket of air, and the ground continued to move. That's before the ground swelled because of the nature of the gas that was excreted.
When I was laying with the corpse, I don't know, I tried to think for so many times, how long was it? I don't know, 10 minutes? An hour? Or 2 hours? I don't know. Till I start feeling I'm not dead. Like I'm alive. Blood all over me. Around me, but that quiet. When I stood up with my hand, held my hand out of the graves. It was a little, not dark, between dark and light. I'm going. No, not thinking where I'm going, but I'm going. Five minutes, 10 minutes I'm going between bushes are near me. And suddenly 3 people coming against me with sacks on the shoulders. There was 3 Polacks, farmers, coming to rob, to take the clothing from the killing people, from the dead people. That was allowed to pick up the clothes. Farmers from all over, Polacks from all over around. These 3 come again. They saw me naked, all over my body, blood. 2 warm bed. Hey, Żydek. A Jew. The 3rd one, also a man with them, with a cross. They don't have any crosses. He has a cross, a big cross, on Jesus, like this. And he says to me, "You go back to the graves where you belonged," in Polish.
attended these executions, and they took pictures the way people took pictures of lynchings in the South.
Why did they take the pictures? On some level, they couldn't not take the pictures. It was powerful. It was attractive. It was meaningful. It was fascinating. And it was something that, at least on a subliminal level, they were proud of. And consequently, they wanted to document it for history.
This film, which lasts less than 2 minutes, I think, was taken by an off-duty German military officer who attended this mass shooting on the coast in Latvia in the latter part of June of 1941, or the very early part of July. The film is a remarkable document, if you will. Within its very brief time period, gives us access to all of the actors in this horrific drama. You have the victims, and you see that in this case these are all men, some of whom have been beaten before being conveyed to the execution site. The shooters, these are uniformed SS and police personnel who are actually carrying out the shootings. Then you have another important actor in the drama, and that is the local auxiliaries who assisted the German SS and police in the shootings. These are the men with white armbands carrying probably their hunting rifles or their weapons that they used for their own purposes. And then, of course, you have the so-called bystanders, the witnesses, including children in short pants who are witnessing this really grotesque spectacle. And they're not witnessing anonymous people being shot. They're witnessing their neighbors, their teachers, their pharmacists, their physicians, people with whom they've grown up, whom they looked up to perhaps. There's a kind of intimacy to the murders that is both incredibly unsettling, but also a kind of grotesque nature to it. For me, the most chilling thing is that for the shooters, there's a kind of quotidian boredom to what they're doing in some cases. You see the guy smoking, blowing out the smoke. Evidence that this is a kind of routine, in some cases boring task that they're following through on. The most chilling set of frames in that for me is this pet dog that someone brings with them. How the dog is startled by the rifle shots and darts across the frame. A kind of reflexive reaction on the part of the animal to the shots. Who brought the dog there? Did the dog go back home with them? What was the dog doing on this scene when people were being murdered? I don't know why that moves me, but it does.
Three major problems with this killing operation that were problems not for the victims, but that were problems for the perpetrator. The first, it was public. The second was that it was too personal. And then finally, the problem with this was it was a waste of bullets.
Heinrich Himmler was horrified. He had found it easy to order other people to kill, but to be in the presence of people being shot in large numbers into a pit and to hear their screaming and moaning and see their writhing was more than he could stomach. And he started running around hysterically screaming, "Kill them quickly, kill them quickly." And this was just about the time when the decision came to move the Jews of Western Europe, which followed directly from the United States joining the war as the result of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. That's when Himmler said, okay, the gloves are off, basically. And they began to think about moving all the Jews of Western Europe.
The real story is not the numbers killed, but all the Jews of town after town, village after village. It's Moshela and Shloimela, it's Chanala and Rivkala, it's Leila. It's family by family, person by person, one by one by one, bullet by bullet by bullet.
I think the Einsatzgruppen were overlooked partly because the Holocaust of the Einsatzgruppen took place in what was then the Soviet Union and for many years since was the Soviet Union. And correspondingly, I think it was difficult to do the historical research. So much of the information on the subject really has emerged since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990, which wasn't that long ago.
The fact that there are people who were murdered, who rest in unmarked graves in people's gardens or in areas that are subject to economic development, you could have supermarkets built on these graves, is a kind of second victimization of these people.
Since 4 or 5 years, we covered 50% of Ukraine and found nearly 850 extermination sites and interviewed 823 witnesses. Each interview is a way to rebuild the crime. So it's not what do you feel, what do you think. It's to say, do you remember the first time the German came in your village? where was the car coming from this side or from this other side, and little by little we reveal the crime.
It's 1 minute to midnight, if not 30 seconds to midnight, to identify these killing fields. And you have this incredible operation of Father Dubois, Roman Catholic priest, who is offering the bystanders the possibility of confession.
Ну, один цоколь жінок, один тих, один з дітьми, один без дітей. Там же так не сортували, нас же не пускали, але ми бачили, що вони так, як виводять, то виводять жінок. А як виводять, відділять мужчин. Ми тут пасли корови, я кажу, а вони були випивші і туди не хотіли вести. А просто шли, завели до нас, хальт, флюхтер, і ми пігнали. Ну ж корови собі пасуться, корову ж я на тімні, корови вільно, без шнурка. І ми йшли, а я чую, пав. Ну ми так глянули, там люди, корови. А потім смерділо. За 2 дні такий сморід був страшний, що потім...
He's talking to them now as old people, and he's mining their memories. These people are helping him find the graves, but he's helping them in a sense to unpack the memories that were formed on that day. These are kids who, in most cases, had no participation in the murders themselves, but they were participants in the sense that they witnessed it, and they have these memories inside them. And they tell him in a way that is remarkable to observe.
А як тут із поїзда батьки викидали дітей, ті діти лежали, то сама на свої очі бачила, що дитина втікла до села. Поліцай, такі колійові були поліцаї. Він 7 разів ту дитину стріляв.
От повели їх, через крохи, як узяли стріляти, як узяли бити, то ми тоді не робили, не плакали.
Покладуть радок, пробив, то живий, не живий, кладуть знов.
Я не знаю, як забили, як я йшла до баби, то я йшла до той поліціянт, 2 діток посадив.
То я знаю.
Коли школи, отак посадив.
Маленьких.
Отак маленьких. Да при мені стріляв. То я так злякалася. Всі кровненький хліб держали в руках.
These were not anonymous victims. These were respected members of the community up until the time of the shootings in some cases. And I think this local, intimate community character of these murders is what makes them so horrific for us to even consider.
We were looking for what happened in the killing place, and somebody told me there is an old lady here. She was there, and I made an interview, and I said, "You were here?" Yes, at 5 in the morning they saw me, and they told me to come with my spade, and say, "What did you do?" Say, "I ran to see my mother," and I say, "What must I do?" And she said, "You have to go, otherwise they will kill you." We were asked to go down in the mass grave. They were shooting Jews. Immediately after the shooting, we had to go down with our spade and with our naked feet to walk on the corpse to make them flat and to put a little bit of sand so the other Jews could go quickly in the mass grave.
И вот оно все запомнилось, как бы это вчера было. Также же, говорят, стоны были там. Они когда их зарыли, это мешало, или бульдозером, или лопатами, ну, в общем, неизвестно, но сверху прикрыли это все. Да вот стоны были. И слышно, что там живых много оставалось, потому что они ж так, может, ранили, а может, человек так уже с перепугу падал уже за своими, как говорится. Вот слышны были стоны, крики.
One old lady, she was laying in her bed, and she told me, "I was still living here when I was a child, and I still wonder why they killed 1,000 Jews in front of my window." And we're looking by the window, saw the mass grave just in front, and she's dying in front of the mass grave. Without any memorial, she's the only witness. That's also the great fear that we have. The last witnesses sometimes are on their bed dying, and the mass grave is just in front of the house, but where They will be dead. Who will know? Nobody.
By 1943, it was obvious that Germany was losing the war, and in particular, the Russians had turned the tide and were beginning to move inexorably toward Germany, ultimately, of course, to end up in Berlin in 1945. But the Einsatzgruppen leadership realized that they were going to have to cover up their crimes, not simply leave these pits covered with a foot of dirt all over Eastern Europe and Russia. Paul Blobel was assigned at the beginning to be one of the officers in the Einsatzgruppen, but he was really traumatized by some of the early mass killings that he directed. The leader's punishment was to give Blobel the assignment of digging up and burning all these hundreds of thousands of bodies. And then at the end of the war, Blobel became one of the key figures in the Nuremberg trial, trial number 9, of the Einsatzgruppen that was run by a young American named Ben Ferenz, and was, in the course of time, duly hanged for his crimes.
The case we present is a plea of humanity to law. We shall establish, beyond the realm of doubt, facts which, before the dark decade of the Third Reich, would have seemed incredible.
The first impressions were not really first impressions because I had met them types like that before outside as an investigator in the concentration camps. But if you were to meet them at a country club, at a reception, they would look the same as others, perhaps better dressed, certainly in their uniforms with their polished black boots, they would look better. They were intelligent, nice looking, efficient, able civil servants. The notion that these must be wild dogs who go out and every day shoot little children because they're Jews and throw them up and use them as target practice or smash their heads against a tree as they did, that these were not human. They were very human. You wouldn't tell the difference between them and going to a country club in Westchester. One of them said, "What, Jews were killed? I hear that for the first time in this courtroom." And we've got the evidence of the speeches telling him what their job is. We got his reports, how many people in his unit killed how many Jews in how many dozens of towns all across Europe and so on. And he says, I hear for the first time. Well, I tell you, the impulse on my part was to reach over and grab his tongue and rip it out of his mouth. But there was no limit, no shame. Prosecution rested its case after 2 days, and I didn't want to talk to any of them, and I didn't talk to any of them during the trial. The only time I varied from that was when the lead defendant, Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, Major General in the SS, was sentenced to death, and I knew that he was the father of 5 children. I knew that he had admitted to killing approximately 90,000 Jews, and I went down to the death house to have a word with him. And I went down and I said to him, Herr Ohlendorf, is there anything, I spoke to him in German, is there anything that you want to tell me, anything I can do for you at this stage? And we both knew that he was a dead man. And he looked at me and he said, the Jews will suffer for what you have done to me. I've seen pictures of him being dropped on the gallows. I have pictures of him lying in a coffin. I have the medical report of how many minutes it took him to die after being hanged, but that was the only conversation I ever had with any of my defendants, and it's the only conversation I ever wanted to have.
There's a reason to study Holocausts and other mass killings. we think of them as isolated individual events with no connection with the rest of the world, and there's just no such thing in this rich, interconnected world we live in. Ultimately, I think we have to understand how people can be prepared by institutions and organizations to use horrific violence outside of the realm of what we consider civilized behavior. I mean, it's ironic if you think about it. We were all killing, but there are rules even for killing, and there should be.
I never said this is a German characteristic. It's not a German characteristic at all. It's practiced in many parts of the world at different times. Most wars are fought by and led by educated people who are determined to kill all the adversaries, whether they're innocent or guilty. But these are the policies which come from the top, from educated people. They don't come from wild beasts.
We really believe there's a phenomenon of people being overexposed and undereducated. They're confronted with images and with media and with Hollywood films, but they don't really know the history behind that. And we believe that this history has to be taught in a very careful and a very clear and a very contextualized way. Why? Well, the easy answer is we don't want this to happen again.
It's hard to look at these things, and that's why we must look at these things. They unleash within us a feeling of shame. Shame not because we were the perpetrators, but shame because we remember the same species that perpetrated this crime. But if you feel uncomfortable, that's good. If we ever feel comfortable, if we ever feel easy, then something deeply and profoundly moral within our own humanity has been shattered and lost.
The woman, her name was Gloria, and she was very friend with a girl named Dora in the ghetto. She was going every night to give food, and one day she couldn't go because she was beaten by a policeman and so on. And the day of the killing, she saw all the column of the Jews going outside of the ghetto. And Dora, who was the Jewish girl who knew the policeman, she asked the authorization to say goodbye. So she went outside the column and she kisses Gloria to say goodbye, we have to be killed. And her mother called back in Yiddish to say, join us now. And they went and have been shot. And she told me 3 times per year, I go to pray on the mass grave. She says, for me, it's not the mass grave. It's a tomb of Dora. And I said to Almighty, never forget that. It's a tomb of Dora.